A flight attendant named Linda kicks out a black billionaire, unaware of his true identity. But 20 minutes later, her arrogance backfires, and Harry gets the ultimate revenge. What happens next will change Linda's life in ways she never expected. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Harry wiped the sweat from his brow as he stacked the last of the empty soup pots in the shelter's kitchen. The familiar scent of dish soap and leftover stew filled the air as he looked around the now clean space with quiet satisfaction. For the past 6 hours, he had served meals, washed dishes, and talked with the shelter's guests, just as he did every Wednesday when he was in town. "Thanks again for your help today, Harry," called Martha, the shelter's coordinator, her gray hair tied back in a messy bun. "You're such a blessing to us." Harry smiled warmly. "You know I love being here, Martha." He grabbed his worn denim jacket from the hook by the door, checking his watch. He had just enough time to make his flight. As he walked to his modest Toyota Camry in the parking lot, Harry thought about how different his life could be. With billions in his bank account from his successful tech company, he could be living in mansions, driving luxury cars, or sailing on private yachts. Instead, he chose a simple 3-bedroom house and preferred spending his time serving others. The afternoon sun felt warm on his face as he drove to the airport, his favorite faded Beatles t-shirt comfortable against his skin. Harry had learned long ago that true happiness wasn't found in showing off wealth or seeking attention. His mind drifted to his childhood, when his own family had struggled to make ends meet. Those memories kept him grounded, reminding him why he chose to live differently than most billionaires. Pulling into the airport parking garage, Harry grabbed his well-worn backpack, the same one he'd had for the past 5 years. Inside was a change of clothes and his laptop, all he needed for his overnight trip home. As he walked through the terminal in his comfortable jeans and sneakers, no one gave him a second glance, just another traveler making his way home. That's exactly how Harry liked it. In a world where wealth often meant flashy displays and constant attention, he found peace in being unknown. His mother's words echoed in his mind. "Your worth isn't in what you own, but in how you treat others." It was a lesson he carried close to his heart, especially on days like today when he could serve others without anyone knowing his true net worth. Harry approached the security checkpoint, joining the long line of travelers. The TSA agent barely glanced at him as she checked his ID, her eyes glazing over his photo before waving him through with a dismissive flick of her wrist. He noticed how she had greeted the businessman in front of him with a warm, "Have a nice flight, sir," but offered Harry nothing but silence. At the X-ray machine, he patiently removed his shoes and placed his backpack in the gray bin. The security officer pointed at Harry's laptop with an impatient gesture. "Take it out," he barked, though the sign clearly showed this requirement and Harry was already doing so. Making his way to the check-in counter, Harry stood quietly in line. When it was his turn, the airline attendant continued typing on her computer for several moments before acknowledging him, though she had been quick to greet previous passengers with a smile. "Destination?" she asked flatly, not making eye contact. "Chicago, please," Harry replied politely. She sighed as if his presence was an inconvenience. "ID?" Her fingers clicked against the keyboard with sharp, irritated taps. After a prolonged moment, she pushed his boarding pass across the counter without a word, already looking past him to the next person in line. Harry gathered his documents, maintaining his characteristic calm despite the cold treatment. As he turned away, he heard the same attendant's voice transform into a cheerful chirp as she greeted the next passenger. "Good afternoon, sir. How are you today?" Moving through the terminal, Harry noticed how other white travelers in business attire were met with respectful nods and friendly greetings from airport staff, while he seemed to become almost invisible. A coffee cart vendor even served 2 customers who had arrived after him before finally turning to take his order with obvious reluctance. Harry made his way down the jet bridge, his backpack slung over one shoulder. As he stepped onto the plane, the fresh smell of leather seats and pine-scented cleaner filled his nostrils. The first-class cabin gleamed with its polished surfaces and plush seating. A tall flight attendant with perfectly coiffed hair and sharp features stood at the entrance. Her name tag read, Linda. and her lips pressed into a thin line as she watched Harry approach. Her eyes narrowed, tracking his movements as if he were out of place. "Excuse me, sir," Linda called out, her voice carrying a note of authority that made several passengers look up. "This is the first-class cabin." She emphasized each word as if speaking to someone who might not understand English. Harry smiled gently. "Yes, I know." Linda stepped directly into his path, her perfectly manicured hand extended. "I'll need to see your boarding pass." Her tone made it clear she expected to find him in the wrong section. Harry noticed how she hadn't asked to see anyone else's ticket, but he maintained his characteristic calm. Without a word, he reached into his pocket and produced his first-class boarding pass. Linda snatched the ticket from his hand, studying it with obvious skepticism. She turned it over, held it up to the light, and examined every detail as if searching for signs of forgery. The other passengers had fallen silent, watching the scene unfold. "Is there a problem?" Harry asked softly, his voice steady and kind despite the humiliating scrutiny. Linda cleared her throat loudly. "Sir, I'm going to need you to verify how you obtained this ticket." Her voice carried through the cabin, drawing more attention from the other passengers. Harry maintained his composure. "I purchased it through the airline's website just like everyone else." "Really?" Linda's eyebrows arched high. "These tickets cost thousands of dollars." She emphasized the word thousands, as if it were impossible for him to afford such a sum. A woman across the aisle shifted uncomfortably in her seat, avoiding eye contact. Other passengers pretended to be absorbed in their phones or magazines, but their tense shoulders betrayed their awareness of the situation. "I'm well aware of the cost," Harry replied calmly. "I fly first class regularly." Linda let out a short, dismissive laugh. "Sir, I've worked this route for 15 years and I've never seen you before. Perhaps you're confused about which section you're supposed to be in." "I assure you I'm in the correct seat." Harry's voice remained steady, though his hands gripped the armrests a bit tighter. Linda stepped back and pulled out her phone. "I'm calling security. Something isn't right here, and we take safety very seriously." She dialed a number, speaking in hushed but urgent tones. Within minutes, 2 airport security officers appeared at the cabin door. Linda pointed at Harry. "This passenger's story isn't adding up, and I don't feel comfortable with him remaining on board." "Ma'am, his ticket appears valid," one officer said quietly. "I don't care what it appears to be," Linda snapped. "As senior flight attendant, I have the authority to remove any passenger I deem suspicious, and I want him off this flight." The security officers exchanged glances before approaching Harry. "Sir, we're going to have to ask you to gather your belongings and come with us." Harry looked around the cabin, noting the mix of embarrassment and discomfort on his fellow passengers' faces. With quiet dignity, he stood and retrieved his backpack from the overhead compartment. As he was escorted off the plane, Linda watched with a satisfied expression, straightening her uniform as if she'd just handled a serious security threat. Harry walked through the jet bridge with measured steps, his shoulders straight despite the weight of what had just happened. The security officers, now seeming unsure of themselves, kept glancing at his valid first-class ticket. "We apologize for the inconvenience, sir," one of them mumbled, but Harry barely heard him. In the terminal, Harry found a quiet corner near his gate. The planes outside gleamed under the afternoon sun, their engines humming as they prepared for takeoff. He pulled out his phone, his fingers hovering over the screen for just a moment before dialing. "James," he spoke softly into the phone, "I need you to gather the legal team. Something's happened." He paused, listening. "No, I'm fine, but I was just removed from Flight 2317 for—" He took a deep breath. "Well, I think we both know why." Through the large windows, Harry watched as his intended flight began to taxi away from the gate. His reflection stared back at him. A man in simple jeans and a well-worn t-shirt, standing with quiet dignity. Meanwhile, aboard the plane, Linda busied herself with pre-flight preparations, a self-satisfied smile playing at the corners of her mouth. She straightened the items in her service cart with particular attention, pleased with how she'd handled the situation. "That's how you maintain standards in first class," she muttered to herself as she checked the champagne supply. The plane lifted off the runway, leaving Harry behind, but carrying with it the seeds of consequences Linda couldn't yet imagine. 20 minutes into the flight, Linda hummed to herself as she arranged the drink cart, still feeling pleased about maintaining what she considered to be proper standards in first class. The cabin's gentle hum was interrupted by a sharp crackle from the intercom. "Linda, please come to the cockpit immediately." The captain's voice was unusually tense. She frowned, setting down the glass she'd been polishing. As she made her way to the front of the plane, she noticed her junior flight attendant giving her an odd look. The cockpit door opened to reveal Captain Stevens, his face drawn and serious. "Close the door behind you, Linda." "Is everything all right?" she asked, her stomach tightening at his expression. "We just received an urgent call from corporate." The captain's words came out slowly, deliberately. "The passenger you had removed from first class? That was Harry Rodriguez." Linda's brow furrowed. "I don't understand. Who is—" "He owns 30% of this airline, Linda. He's one of our largest investors and sits on the board of directors." The blood drained from Linda's face. Her legs went weak and she had to grip the back of the captain's seat to steady herself. "But he was he didn't look—" "Corporate wants you to report directly to the main office as soon as we land." Captain Stevens shook his head. "They're saying this could be very serious." Linda's throat went dry. The image of Harry's calm demeanor as she'd humiliated him flashed through her mind. She remembered his quiet dignity, his polite responses to her accusations, and the valid first-class ticket he'd shown her multiple times. "Oh God," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What have I done?" Her perfectly ordered world began to crumble around her as the full weight of her actions sank in. She'd let her prejudices and assumptions guide her actions, and now she was facing the consequences of judging someone based solely on their appearance. "You're to continue your duties for the remainder of the flight," the captain said firmly, "but report directly to the main office upon landing. They're expecting you." Linda nodded numbly, her hands shaking as she reached for the cockpit door. The short walk back to the cabin felt like the longest of her life, her mind racing with the implications of what she'd done. Linda's hands trembled as she guided passengers to their seats on off the flight. Each smile felt forced, each greeting hollow. Her perfect uniform and carefully styled hair couldn't mask the fear that gripped her heart. Down in the terminal, she could see suits rushing back and forth, the airline's legal team scrambling to contain the situation. Through the window, she glimpsed a sleek private jet taxiing toward the runway, and her stomach clenched. That had to be Harry Rodriguez, the man she had so terribly wronged. Her phone buzzed again, the fifth message from Human Resources in the past hour. She couldn't bring herself to read it. The words from her earlier conversation with the station manager still rang in her ears. "This could end careers, Linda. This could end the airline." A young passenger asked for help with his bag, and Linda flinched at the request, startled out of her thoughts. She assisted him mechanically, her mind elsewhere. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Harry's dignified expression as she'd forced him off the plane. How had she been so blind? So cruel. "Linda?" Her junior flight attendant touched her arm gently. "The legal team needs to see you ASAP." Linda nodded, her throat too tight to speak. As she made her way to the front of the plane, she could feel the other crew members watching her, their expressions a mix of pity and disapproval. Her carefully constructed world of authority and control was crumbling, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Linda's heels clicked against the polished airport floor as she made her way to the main office. Each step echoed in her ears like a countdown to judgment, though she kept her chin high and her shoulders back. A few colleagues passed by, averting their eyes or whispering behind their hands. "It can't be that bad," she muttered to herself, straightening her navy uniform jacket. A write-up, maybe a suspension at worst. But the tremor in her hands betrayed her uncertainty. The message on her phone had been brief but ominous. "Report to the main office immediately. Meeting with senior management." Linda had dealt with passenger complaints before, they were part of the job. But this was different. This wasn't just any passenger. As she walked past the first-class lounge where she'd first seen Harry Rodriguez, The memory of her behavior made her stomach turn. His calm demeanor, his quiet dignity, the way he'd simply walked away without arguing, it all took on a different meaning now. She remembered the contempt in her voice, the assumptions she'd made, and for the first time, she felt truly ashamed. Outside the main office, Linda paused to check her reflection in a window. Her face looked pale, and worry lines creased her forehead. The sound of raised voices carried through the door. She recognized the regional manager's distinctive boom. "The PR nightmare alone," she heard someone say before the voices dropped to murmurs. Linda's carefully maintained composure began to crack. What if Harry Rodriguez decided to sue? What if he went public with the story? In today's world, something like this could go viral in minutes. Her thoughts raced to all the other times she might have misjudged passengers, all the small cruelties she justified as maintaining standards. She jumped when her phone buzzed again, another message from HR asking for her exact location. The reality of her situation was finally sinking in. This wasn't going to be a simple reprimand. This could be the end of everything she'd worked for. Taking a deep breath, Linda reached for the office door handle, her hand shaking. 23 years of service, her entire identity wrapped up in this airline, and it could all disappear because of one terrible mistake. As she turned the handle, one question kept repeating in her mind. What would Harry Rodriguez do next? Linda stepped into the office, where Mr. Collins sat behind his mahogany desk, his expression grave. The room felt smaller than usual, the walls closing in as she took her seat in one of the stiff-backed chairs. "Walk me through exactly what happened on Flight 2317, Mr. Collins said, his voice flat and professional. Linda straightened her back, clinging to her usual air of authority. "Well, I noticed a man in first class who didn't appear to belong there. He was completely inappropriate for the section." She paused, moistening her lips. "I was simply following procedure when I asked to see his ticket." Mr. Collins's face remained impassive as she continued. "When he showed me his ticket, I had concerns about its authenticity. In my experience, certain types of passengers sometimes try to upgrade themselves without proper authorization." Linda's voice grew defensive. "I made a judgment call to protect the integrity of our first-class service." "What do you mean by certain types of passengers, Linda?" Mr. Collins interrupted, his eyes narrowing. Linda shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "I just mean people who don't meet our usual first-class passenger profile. It's our job to maintain standards, isn't it? I've been doing this for 23 years and I know when something doesn't look right." "So you had him removed from the plane," Mr. Collins stated. "Yes, for the comfort and security of our other passengers." Linda's voice wavered slightly. "I was following protocol." Mr. Collins leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming against the desk. "Protocol requires you to verify a passenger's ticket, Linda, not make assumptions based on their appearance." He stood up, straightening his tie. "Please wait here while I discuss this situation with the executive team." "But surely you understand," Linda started. "Wait here," Mr. Collins repeated firmly, leaving her alone in the suddenly quiet office. Linda sat rigid in her chair, staring at the various airline awards and certificates on the wall, several of which she'd helped the company earn. The tick of the wall clock seemed to grow louder with each passing second as she waited, her certainty about her actions crumbling bit by bit. Mr. Collins returned to the office, his face stern as he closed the door behind him. He held a manila folder in his hands, which he placed carefully on his desk before sitting down. "Linda, this is a serious situation," he began, his voice measured. "The executive team has reviewed the incident, and effective immediately, you are suspended without pay pending an internal investigation." The color drained from Linda's face. "Suspended without pay?" Her voice cracked. "This is ridiculous. I was doing my job." "Your actions today exposed this airline to significant liability," Mr. Collins continued. "We have a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination of any kind." Linda's hands gripped the arms of her chair. "Discrimination? That's not what happened at all. I was maintaining our standards." "Please turn in your airline ID and security badge before you leave," Mr. Collins interrupted, sliding a formal notice across the desk. Linda stared at the paper, her hands trembling as she picked it up. "How am I supposed to pay my mortgage I have bills due next week." Her voice rose with panic. "My daughter's college tuition payment is coming up." "I understand this is difficult," Mr. Collins said, "but these are the consequences of your actions today." Linda stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. She yanked her ID badge from her uniform, dropping it on the desk with shaking hands. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back furiously. 23 years of service, she said, her voice bitter, and this is what I get for trying to maintain standards. As she walked through the office corridors, Linda held her head high, though her lower lip trembled. Other employees quickly looked away as she passed, news of the incident having already spread. By the time she reached her car in the parking lot, her hands were shaking so badly she could barely get her key in the ignition. Linda pulled into her driveway, the familiar sight of her modest two-story home doing little to calm her nerves. She sat in the car for several minutes, trying to compose herself before facing Paul. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dashboard as she wiped away the last traces of tears from her cheeks. Inside, Paul was in the kitchen preparing dinner. The smell of his famous meatloaf filled the house, but Linda's stomach was too knotted to feel hungry. "You're home early," he said, looking up from the stove with a warm smile. "Everything okay?" Linda forced a casual tone. "Oh, just some workplace drama. They're doing an investigation about a passenger complaint, so I have to take some time off." Paul's forehead creased with concern. "Time off? That doesn't sound good." "It's temporary," Linda said quickly, hanging up her coat. "You know how airlines are these days. They have to investigate everything." She tried to laugh, but it came out hollow. Later that evening, alone in their bedroom, Linda sat at her vanity and stared at her reflection. The gravity of her situation pressed down on her like a physical weight. Their savings wouldn't last long, not with the mortgage, car payments, and Jessica's college tuition. She opened her planner, looking at the column of upcoming bills with growing anxiety. Her fingers traced over the tuition due date. They had always lived comfortably on their combined income, but without her paycheck. Linda's throat tightened. She couldn't bear to tell Paul the whole truth about Harry, about her suspension without pay, about how she had let her prejudices cloud her judgment. The shame of it burned in her chest. "It's just temporary," she whispered to herself. But the words rang hollow in the quiet room. Deep down, she knew this was more serious than she was letting on. Her hands trembled as she closed the planner, trying to push away thoughts of their dwindling savings account. In a stark conference room at the airline's headquarters, Mr. Collins and the HR team pored over personnel files spread across the long table. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows as they examined complaint after complaint about Linda's behavior. "This one's from 3 months ago," said Sarah from HR, pushing forward a document. "A Latino family in first class. Linda questioned their tickets 4 times and made comments about them being in the wrong section." Mr. Collins rubbed his temples. "How many is that now?" 17 documented complaints in the past year alone, Sarah replied, her voice heavy. "All following a similar pattern: passengers of color, people dressed casually, younger travelers in premium seats." The legal team's representative, Mr. Peterson, cleared his throat. "The pattern is undeniable. We have multiple witnesses describing her tone as condescending and hostile. Several passengers specifically used the word discriminatory in their formal complaints." Another HR member, James, pulled up a spreadsheet on his laptop. "What's concerning is that these complaints were filed across different routes, different months. This isn't about having a bad day or a single lapse in judgment." "And how were these complaints handled previously?" Mr. Collins asked, his expression grim. Sarah shuffled through more papers. Most were addressed with verbal warnings. 2 resulted in written warnings, but... She paused. "It seems they were never properly followed up on." "The incident with Mr. Harrison has exposed a serious systemic failure," Mr. Peterson said. "We should have caught this pattern much sooner. Now we're potentially facing not just his legal action, but others might come forward too." The room fell silent as the weight of the situation settled over them. Mr. Collins looked at the stack of complaints, each one representing a passenger who had experienced discrimination under their watch. The liability here is enormous, Mr. Peterson continued. And beyond the legal implications, there's the potential damage to our reputation. Social media is already picking up the story about Mr. Harrison's treatment. Sarah nodded solemnly. This goes beyond a simple suspension. The evidence suggests a clear pattern of discriminatory behavior that's been ongoing for years. In his spacious yet modestly furnished home office, Harry sat across from his legal team. The morning sun filtered through the windows, casting a warm glow on the polished wooden conference table. 3 lawyers from his most trusted firm presented him with a thick folder of settlement offers from the airline. "They're offering unlimited first-class travel for life," said Margaret Chen, his lead counsel, pushing forward a document, "plus a substantial monetary settlement." Harry shook his head, a gentle smile on his face. "That's not what this is about." "Mr. Rodriguez," Thomas Baker, another attorney, leaned forward. "The airline is practically begging to make this right. They're terrified of the PR nightmare if this goes public." Harry stood up and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. "You know what I kept thinking about while I was walking off that plane? Not about myself, but about all the other people who faced the same treatment, but didn't have my resources to fight back." The lawyers exchanged glances as Harry turned back to face them. "I want to propose something different," he said, returning to his seat. "Instead of compensation, I want the airline to implement a comprehensive diversity and sensitivity training program. Not just a one-time seminar, but an ongoing commitment to addressing discrimination at every level." Margaret nodded slowly, making notes. "What specifically are you envisioning?" "Regular training sessions for all staff, from gate agents to flight attendants, external audits to track progress, a clear reporting system for incidents of discrimination." Harry's voice grew passionate but remained measured. "And most importantly, I want them to create a diversity and inclusion board that includes members from various communities." "That's actually quite brilliant," Thomas admitted. "Instead of just punishing one person or taking a settlement, you're pushing for systemic change." "Exactly," Harry said softly. "Linda's actions weren't born in a vacuum. They're symptoms of a larger problem, and that's what needs to be addressed." The legal team began drafting Harry's proposal, their pens scratching against paper as they transformed his vision into actionable items. Harry watched them work, feeling at peace with his decision. Money couldn't solve everything, but perhaps this could be the start of real change. Linda's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, Mr. Collins's name flashing on the screen. Her hands trembled as she answered the call. "Linda, we need to discuss the investigation," Mr. Collins said, his voice grave. "The team has uncovered multiple incidents over the past few years. Complaints about discriminatory behavior, hostile treatment of passengers." Linda gripped the counter, her knuckles turning white. "But those were all justified." "Linda," Mr. Collins cut her off firmly. "This is serious. We'll be making our final decision by the end of the week." After hanging up, Linda slumped against the refrigerator. Paul walked into the kitchen, concern etched on his face. "Everything okay, honey?" he asked, reaching for her hand. "It's fine," Linda said quickly, pulling away. "Just work stuff. Nothing to worry about." Paul frowned. "You've been saying that for days now. I know something's wrong." Before Linda could respond, their 12-year-old daughter Emily appeared in the doorway, looking pale. "Mom, I don't feel so good." Linda rushed to her daughter's side, pressing a hand to her forehead. "You're burning up, sweetie." As she tucked Emily into bed with fever medicine, Linda's mind raced. Their health insurance was through her job. Without it, Emily's regular checkups, medications, everything would have to come out of pocket. They had some savings, but not enough to sustain them long term. Back in the living room, Paul was waiting. "Linda, please talk to me. How bad is this work situation?" Linda sank into the couch, the weight of everything finally crushing her carefully maintained facade. I might lose my job," she whispered, her voice breaking. "And with Emily sick and the mortgage and your part-time work?" She couldn't finish the sentence. The reality of their situation hit her like a physical blow. Their entire life, their home, their healthcare, their stability, all of it hinged on her income. Years of building her career, climbing the ranks, and now it could all disappear because of one terrible decision. Paul reached for her hand again, and this time she didn't pull away. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Linda stared at their clasped hands, tears welling in her eyes. "I thought I could fix it. I thought—" She swallowed hard. "I didn't want to admit how badly I messed up." Linda sat alone in her home office, staring at the latest email from HR. The words blurred before her eyes. Suspension extended indefinitely. Her stomach churned as she read through the details. More complaints had surfaced, dating back years. Former colleagues she'd thought were friends had come forward. Lita from Gate 12 told them about the time Linda had made an elderly Asian couple cry over their broken English. Marcus remembered how she'd questioned a Muslim woman's first-class ticket 3 separate times. Even Jenny, her former mentee, had shared stories about Linda's harsh comments toward passengers she deemed unsuitable for premium seating. The walls of her small office seemed to close in around her. Each revelation felt like another brick added to the wall being built between her and her career. 23 years of service, reduced to a collection of damning testimonials. Her phone buzzed with a text from Carol, one of her closest work friends. Linda's hand shook as she read it. "I'm sorry, Linda. They asked me about the incident with the Spanish family last summer. I couldn't lie." Linda remembered that day. She'd made assumptions about a well-dressed Hispanic family, suggesting they might be more comfortable in economy class. At the time, she'd convinced herself she was just doing her job, maintaining standards. Now, seeing her actions through others' eyes, shame burned in her chest. She opened her work email, hoping to find some support, but her inbox was eerily empty. The same people who used to send her funny memes and invite her to coffee breaks were now silent. The realization hit her hard. She wasn't just losing her job, she was losing her entire professional community. Sitting there, surrounded by family photos and her numerous service awards, Linda felt more alone than ever. Each certificate on the wall now seemed to mock her. Outstanding service, excellence in leadership, team player of the year. What did any of it mean if this was how people really saw her? She thought about Harry, the man whose dignity she'd tried to strip away with her assumptions and prejudices. For the first time, she wondered how many others there had been like him. People she'd hurt without ever facing consequences. People whose stories had never been told until now. The weight of her actions pressed down on her shoulders as she whispered to the empty room, "How did I not see what I was doing?" Linda sat rigidly in her chair, facing the long mahogany conference table where 3 members of the airline's legal team studied her file. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, making the already tense atmosphere feel even more sterile and cold. "Ms. Linda Simpson," the head lawyer, Mrs. Santos, began, her voice steady and professional. "We've reviewed the findings of our investigation thoroughly. The evidence shows a consistent pattern of discriminatory behavior spanning several years." Linda's throat went dry. Her hands, clasped tightly in her lap, began to tremble. "We have documented incidents involving passengers of various ethnicities, religions, and backgrounds," another lawyer added, flipping through a thick folder. "The incident with Mr. Rodriguez was not an isolated event, but rather the culmination of a troubling history." Linda tried to speak, but her voice came out as a whisper. I never meant to—" "Intent isn't the issue here," Mrs. Santos interrupted firmly. "The impact of your actions has created significant liability for this airline. We're facing potential discrimination lawsuits, negative press, and damage to our reputation." The third lawyer, a younger man with kind eyes, leaned forward. "Given the severity and frequency of these incidents, the company is moving toward termination. We wanted to inform you personally before the final decision is made." The word termination hit Linda like a physical blow. 23 years of her life, her identity, her financial security, all of it disappearing before her eyes. The room seemed to spin slightly as the reality of her situation crashed down around her. "But my pension," she managed to say, her voice cracking. "My benefits." "Those details will be addressed in your separation package," Mrs. Santos replied, her tone softening slightly. However, I must be clear, there is very little chance of any other outcome at this point. Linda felt the last threads of control slipping through her fingers. Her carefully constructed world, built on years of what she'd thought was exemplary service, was dissolving like a sandcastle in the tide. She thought about her mortgage, Emily's college fund, Paul's medical insurance, all the responsibilities that had seemed so secure just weeks ago. The lawyers exchanged glances as Linda sat there pale and silent, the weight of her uncertain future pressing down on her shoulders. That evening, Linda's hands shook as she stared at the termination letter on her kitchen table. The official airline letterhead seemed to mock her, its crisp edges and formal language spelling out the end of her career in cold, unforgiving terms. 23 years of service, ended with a few paragraphs of corporate speak. She picked up her coffee mug, but her trembling fingers couldn't hold it steady. Dark liquid sloshed over the rim, staining the crisp white paper. Linda didn't even bother to wipe it away. "Effective immediately," she read aloud, her voice barely a whisper in the empty kitchen. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. The shame hit her in waves. Each time she thought she'd gotten control of herself, another memory would surface. The faces of her co-workers as she'd strutted through the terminal, the way she'd looked down her nose at countless passengers, and finally that last fatal encounter with Harry, the man she'd judged so quickly and so wrongly. Her phone buzzed, another message from her friend Clara at the airline. Linda couldn't bear to read it. Word would spread quickly through the crew. By tomorrow, everyone would know. Linda Simpson, the proud senior flight attendant, fired for discrimination. The thought made her stomach churn. She pushed back from the table and walked to the window, watching the neighbor kids playing basketball in their driveway. Their carefree laughter felt like a stark contrast to the heaviness in her chest. Just weeks ago, she'd felt so secure, so certain of her place in the world. Now everything she'd built, everything she'd counted on, had crumbled because of her own actions. The worst part wasn't losing the job, though that was devastating enough. It was facing the truth about herself. All those complaints hadn't come from nowhere. All those passengers she'd dismissed, looked down on, treated with suspicion or contempt, they'd been right about her. The realization made her legs weak, and she had to grip the kitchen counter to steady herself. The sound of a car in the driveway made her freeze. Paul was home early. How could she tell him? How could she admit that she'd lost everything because of her own prejudice and pride? The shame burned hot in her chest, making it hard to breathe. Linda tried to keep her morning routine the same, making breakfast, packing Paul's lunch, getting Emily ready for school. But everything felt hollow now, like she was acting in a play where nothing was real. "Mom, are you okay?" Emily asked one morning, her face pale and feverish. The girl's persistent cough had gotten worse over the past week. "I'm fine, sweetheart, just eat your breakfast." Linda's voice cracked as she turned away, pretending to busy herself with dishes. That evening, when Paul discovered the pile of unpaid bills hidden in Linda's desk drawer, the facade finally crumbled. 3 months behind on the mortgage?" Paul's voice rose as he waved the statements in the air. "Why didn't you tell me how bad things were getting?" Linda sat rigid in her chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I thought I could fix it. I thought maybe—" "Fix it? How? You lost your job, Linda. And not because of downsizing or budget cuts, because you treated someone terribly." Paul's face was red with anger. "All these years I defended you when people said you were harsh. I made excuses for your attitude, but this—" A harsh coughing sound from upstairs interrupted them. Emily's illness was getting worse, but they couldn't afford the specialist the doctor had recommended. The thought made Linda's chest tighten with panic. "We got another notice from the bank today," Paul said, his voice quieter but heavy with disappointment. "We have 30 days before they start foreclosure." Linda stared at the worn carpet, counting the familiar stains to keep from crying. The house they'd lived in for 15 years, where they'd raised Emily, where they'd built their life. All of it slipping away because of her actions. "I can't even look at you right now," Paul muttered, walking out of the room. That night, Linda sat alone in the dark kitchen, listening to Emily's coughing through the thin walls. The medicine they had wasn't helping anymore, but their insurance had run out with her job. The stack of medical bills on the counter seemed to grow taller every day. She'd always been the one in control, the one with answers, the one who took care of everything. Now she felt powerless, watching her family's security crumble around her with no way to stop it. After a few days, desperate for work, Linda takes a job at a local diner. Linda's hands trembled as she tied the plain blue apron around her waist. The diner's kitchen was hot and cramped, nothing like the pristine galleys she was used to. The smell of grease and coffee filled the air as she grabbed her order pad and stepped out onto the floor. "Table 6 has been waiting for 10 minutes, barked Marge, the head waitress. "And don't forget to refill the sugars before the lunch rush." Linda nodded meekly, her sensible shoes squeaking against the linoleum floor. She approached table 6, where a well-dressed businessman sat tapping impatiently on his phone. "What took you so long?" he snapped, not bothering to look up. "I've been sitting here forever." The words hit Linda like a physical blow. How many times had she used that same tone with passengers? How many times had she made people feel small and insignificant? Throughout her shift, the memories kept flooding back. A teenager rolled her eyes when Linda got her order wrong. A woman in designer clothes spoke to her in the same condescending tone Linda had once used with countless passengers. During her break, Linda sat in the back alley, still wearing her grease-stained apron. Her feet ached, and her back was sore from carrying heavy plates. She thought about Harry, the man whose life she had disrupted so carelessly. She remembered his dignity, his calm demeanor in the face of her cruelty. "Order's up," called the cook, and Linda hurried back inside. As she rushed between tables, carrying plates and fielding complaints, she felt the weight of every dismissive gesture she'd ever made, every harsh word she'd ever spoken. A customer complained about cold coffee, and Linda apologized profusely as she fetched a fresh cup. The woman barely acknowledged her, continuing her conversation as if Linda were invisible. The sting of being treated as less than human brought tears to her eyes, which she quickly blinked away. "Just like you treated others," she whispered to herself as she refilled salt shakers at the counter. The revelation sat heavy in her chest, a truth she could no longer ignore. While Linda struggled with her new reality, Harry continued his regular routine of giving back to the community. On a crisp morning, he stood in the familiar warmth of the Hope Haven homeless shelter, ladling hot soup into bowls for the breakfast line. "Morning, Mr. Rodriguez," smiled Maria, one of the shelter's regular volunteers. "Did you hear? The airline's making some big changes because of you." Harry simply nodded, his gentle eyes focused on the task at hand. "It's not about me," he said softly. "It's about making sure everyone is treated with dignity." The news had spread quickly through the aviation industry. Continental Airways, where the incident had occurred, had announced a comprehensive diversity and sensitivity training program for all their staff. The program would be mandatory for everyone from baggage handlers to executives. Other airlines had taken notice. Within weeks, 2 more major carriers announced similar initiatives. The ripple effect was exactly what Harry had hoped for, though he took no public credit for the change. During a board meeting at Continental Airways, Harry sat quietly as executives presented their new training program. The comprehensive curriculum included workshops on unconscious bias, cultural sensitivity, and proper customer service protocols. Harry listened intently, occasionally offering gentle suggestions to improve the program's effectiveness. "Mr. Rodriguez," one of the board members said, "would you consider speaking at some of these training sessions? Your experience could really drive the message home." Harry shook his head. "The message is more important than the messenger," he replied. "Let's focus on creating lasting change, not on who was wronged." The board members exchanged glances, once again struck by Harry's humility and wisdom. His approach had transformed what could have been a public relations nightmare into an opportunity for industry-wide improvement. As Harry left the meeting, his phone buzzed with messages from other airline CEOs, all wanting to discuss implementing similar programs. He smiled quietly to himself, knowing that sometimes the smallest moments of injustice could lead to the biggest changes, not through anger or revenge, but through patience, understanding, and a commitment to making things better for everyone. Linda adjusted her worn apron, now stained with coffee and grease from the morning rush at Joe's diner. The plastic name tag pinned to her chest felt like a constant reminder of her fall from grace. Her hands, once perfectly manicured for first-class service, were now rough from washing dishes and clearing tables. "Hey, waitress," a man in an expensive suit called out, snapping his fingers. "Some service would be nice." Linda hurried over, notepad in hand. The businessman barely looked up from his phone as he ordered, treating her as if she were invisible. Her cheeks burned with shame as she remembered how she used to look down at service workers in the same way. During her break, Linda sat in the cramped break room, massaging her aching feet. Her new shoes, bought from a discount store, weren't meant for 10-hour shifts on hard floors. She thought about all the times she had judged passengers by their clothes or appearance, never considering their stories or circumstances. "Table 6 needs clearing," called out Mary, her supervisor. "And remember to smile more, Linda. Customers tip better when you're friendly." As Linda cleaned the sticky table, a young mother struggled to calm her crying baby while trying to eat her lunch. Instead of feeling annoyed, as she once would have, Linda felt a surge of sympathy. She brought over some extra napkins and a small cup of warm milk, remembering her own struggles with Emily when she was little. "Thank you," the mother said, genuine gratitude in her eyes. "That's so kind of you." The simple exchange stirred something in Linda. She thought about all the tired parents she'd dismissed on flights, the ones she'd rolled her eyes at when their children were fussy. Each day at the diner brought new encounters that forced her to see people differently. "You're getting better at this," Joe, the diner owner, told her one afternoon. "When you first started, you looked like you'd rather be anywhere else. Now you're actually connecting with the customers." Linda nodded, realizing that he was right. The job she'd initially seen as beneath her had become a daily lesson in humanity. Every customer who treated her dismissively reminded her of her past behavior, and every small act of kindness she received helped her understand the importance of treating others with respect, regardless of their position or appearance. One slow afternoon, the bell above the diner's door chimed. Linda looked up from wiping down the counter to see a middle-aged black man in jeans and a plain gray t-shirt walk in. Her heart skipped a beat as memories of Harry flooded back. The customer had the same quiet dignity, the same understated presence. For a split second, her old instincts tried to surface, the automatic assumptions, the quick judgments. But Linda pushed them away, feeling ashamed of her former self. The man settled into a booth by the window, pulling out a worn paperback book. Linda grabbed a menu and walked over, consciously reminding herself of all the lessons she'd learned these past few months. "Good afternoon," she said warmly, placing the menu in front of him. "Can I start you off with some coffee?" He looked up with kind eyes, reminding her even more of Harry. "That would be wonderful. Thank you." Linda poured his coffee with care, noticing how he said please and thank you for every small gesture, just like Harry had done on that fateful day on the plane. When she returned to take his order, she found herself genuinely interested in making his experience pleasant. "The meatloaf is our specialty today," she offered sincerely. "Our cook, Mike, makes it from his grandmother's recipe." The man smiled. "That sounds perfect. I appreciate the recommendation." As Linda served his meal, she noticed the book he was reading, a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. It sparked a genuine conversation about favorite books, and Linda found herself sharing how her daughter Emily was reading the same novel for school. The interaction was brief, just a normal exchange between server and customer, but it felt profound to Linda. There was no prejudice, no assumption, no judgment, just two human beings sharing a moment of connection over coffee and meatloaf. When the man left, leaving a generous tip and a warm "thank you for the excellent service," Linda stood at the counter, fighting back tears. She thought about how differently she would have treated him just months ago, how many meaningful connections she had missed because of her prejudices. After the customer left, Linda leaned against the counter, her hands trembling slightly as she folded the clean dish towels. The afternoon sun streamed through the diner's windows, casting long shadows across the checkered floor. Her old self would have been mortified to be seen doing such menial work, but something had changed inside her. She thought about her former life, the crisp uniform, the authority, the respect she thought she'd earned. But now she understood that real respect wasn't about status or position. It was about how you treated others regardless of their appearance or station in life. Her eyes welled up as she remembered all the people she must have hurt over the years. How many passengers had she dismissed? How many dreams had she crushed with her harsh words and quick judgments? The weight of it felt heavy on her shoulders. But there was also a strange lightness in her heart. For the first time in her life, Linda felt authentic. Her interactions with customers, though simpler now, were genuine. She had learned to see people as they were, not as her prejudices painted them. The financial struggles were still there. Her family was getting by, but barely. Paul had taken on extra shifts at his job, and they had moved to a smaller apartment. Emily was recovering from her illness, but the medical bills were a constant worry. Yet somehow these hardships had brought them closer together. Linda found herself appreciating the small things she'd never noticed before. The grateful smile of an elderly customer when she took extra time to chat, the relief on a harried mother's face when Linda entertained her fussy toddler for a few moments, the quiet dignity of people from all walks of life who came through the diner's doors. Each day was a lesson in humility, but also in humanity. She was learning that true strength wasn't about maintaining control or asserting authority. It was about having the courage to admit when you were wrong, and the wisdom to learn from your mistakes. As she wiped down another table, Linda realized that while she had lost her career and status, she had gained something far more valuable: a clear conscience and an open heart. Her life wasn't perfect, far from it, but there was a peace in knowing she was finally becoming the person she should have been all along. Linda stood at the diner's entrance after her shift, watching the sunset paint the sky in soft oranges and pinks. Her apron was stained, and her feet ached from the long day of serving customers, but there was a calmness in her heart that she'd never known in her previous life. As she waited for Paul to pick her up, she thought about how different everything was now. The fancy clothes and first-class cabins seemed like another lifetime. Her new uniform might be plain, and her paycheck modest, but each day brought new opportunities to practice the compassion she'd learned through her hardships. She watched as people walked past: businessmen in suits, teenagers in baggy clothes, elderly couples holding hands. Before, she would have categorized them, judged them, placed them in neat little boxes. Everyday encounter with different people is a lesson for her. Now she saw them differently. They were all just people, each with their own stories, struggles, and dreams. The diner job wasn't what she had planned for her life, and some days were harder than others. The bills still piled up, and Emily's medical expenses weren't going away, but this time, a little bit better. But Linda had found something she never expected: a genuine connection with the people she served, a simple joy in making someone's day a little brighter. She thought about Harry sometimes while working, wondering what he would think if he saw her now. Not that it mattered anymore. What mattered was that she was changing, slowly but surely. Each smile she gave, each moment of patience with a difficult customer, each small act of kindness, these were the building blocks of her new life. As Paul's car pulled up to the curb, Linda took one last look at the diner's neon sign glowing in the twilight. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to choose between her old ways and the person she was becoming. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in her life, she was ready to face it with an open heart. And hopefully, one day, she could personally ask Harry for forgiveness. If you enjoyed the story of Harry and Linda, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.